The Shadow, the Hydra by Maxwell Grant. Chapter 3 Master of Flame. The Shadow was surging forward, intent upon taking Carthel alive. To make the fellow talk about the Hydra, Carthel fired one frantic shot, missing the Shadow by 3 feet. The bullet didn't even ring the limousine, for it was gone from behind the path that the Shadow had retaken. Carthel wasn't the only smart chauffeur on hand. Stanley Cranston's man was trained to pull away when he heard shooting start, though Stanley regarded it odd that a complacent gentleman like Cranston would be in the vicinity of gunfire so often. The chauffeur never questioned his master's orders, nor did he think link Cranston with the Shadow, among other elements in Stanley's training. He'd learned to mind his own business thoroughly. As for Carthel, he was thinking only of the Shadow under the muzzle of an automatic that the cloaked fighter aimed. Carthel tried another gun stab that didn't deliver. The first shot from the Shadow's gun preceded Carthel's tug of the trigger. The leaden slug found Carthel's forearm, just above his gun hand. Jaunced by the impact, Carthel staggered around, his arm flinging wide, while his loosened hand let his revolver scale against the wall below the conservatory windows. Wounded and unarmed, Carthel turned to run. Then, seeing the Shadow looming hard upon him, the stocky man turned back. Diving for the wall, Carthel grabbed up his gun with his left hand and swung triumphantly, hoping to cripple the Shadow in turn. Within reach, the Shadow made a swoop to grab Carthel's arm, but the fellow made a successful dodge along the wall, escaping the cloaked fighter's clutch. It was death for Carthel. Down came a great chunk of the conservatory wall, a mass of molten metal and white-hot glass. Carthel hadn't realized how quickly the conservatory had become a furnace under the feeding spray of gasoline which he himself had started. Probably Carthel never realized it, for he was buried out of sight in an avalanche as deadly as the flow of volcanic lava. Only by a long, swift dive did the Shadow escape the fiery debris, wheeling from the scorching flames that now were climbing the vine pillars. The Shadow made a wider circuit toward the rear of the mansion, hoping to overtake the two treacherous servants who had helped Carthel with the hose. They were beyond the tennis courts, those crooks and others. The Shadow couldn't see the trucks because of an intervening wall, but he did spy the last of the men who were bringing burdens from Glencoe's side door. The Shadow gave them a weird laugh that made them falter. Then, in response to the mirth, came a deluge of gunfire from beyond the tennis courts. That barrage was meant for the Shadow. Though it didn't reach him, it allowed the burden carriers to escape. Attacked by the whole Hydra tribe, the Shadow needed shelter of his own in order to fight back. He took the only good spot he saw, which happened to be the best, the very door from which the Hydra's men had brought the last of Glencoe's curios. Once within the shelter, the Shadow jabbed a few shots toward the distant marksmen, dropping deeper to let them spot themselves with unwary shots. The Shadow suddenly lost interest in such random battle. Here, within the fire-gorged mansion, the Shadow was viewing the pathways through which the Hydra's workers had maneuvered their departure with a vast supply of loot. It wasn't a question now of rescuing helpless persons who weren't even likely to be around. Here was the Shadow's chance to trap some of the Hydra's clan in the very pitfall which they had designed as coverage for crime. One candidate was already in sight. Turning a corner toward the Shadow was the very man who had signaled the destruction of the conservatory, Glencoe's false secretary, Selbert. Mere chance warned Selbert of danger ahead. Dropping back as a stretch of floor gave underfoot, Selbert looked up and saw the Shadow bearing straight toward him. With a wild look, the dapper man turned and dashed back around the corner. With a leap, the Shadow was across the cavity. Around the corner he sidestepped as Selbert peppered frantic shots in return. Scrambling for Glencoe's study, Selbert stumbled on the threshold. He was up again, clutching his gun in a precious bundle when the shadow overtook him. With a wild wrench, Selber went through the doorway right into the arms of Willard Mance. The Hydra head was perfect in his pretext. He didn't waste half a second asking any questions. One look told him that Selbert had met with something supernormal, and Mance acted just as though he expected someone like the Shadow. He pinned Selbert against the only stretch of wall that the flames hadn't reached, grabbed the man's gun, and tried to get the bundle. "I've got him," bellowed Mance. "The traitor who murdered Glencoe and robbed him. Help me, somebody!" It wasn't just anybody who appeared. Staring across Selbert's shoulder, Mance looked amazed when he saw the Shadow enter. It looked like Selbert's crime, even though he hadn't done it. To all appearances, Mance had reached the study too late to aid Glencoe and was now demanding vengeance for his murdered friend. That fact, plus the Shadow's own wish to check on Glencoe's death, worked in favor of the Hydra's cause. The Shadow turned toward Glencoe's body, and saw the desk beyond it, strewn with papers and the flames had just begun to devour. Mance had stayed to see Selber had missed nothing of value, and that sudden doubt flashed to the Shadow. He wheeled automatic ready in his fist. Mance and Selber were already gone, the Hydra head shoving the tooth through the doorway to the hall, their departure drowned by a sudden crackle of flames that poured through the study walls. If Selber had paused long enough to fire, he might have clipped the Shadow, but the secretary was too fearful, too amazed by Mance's sudden shift. As for Mance, his gun was out, but he didn't have it aimed when he fired. The gun was wide, and he was smart enough to duck through the door ahead of the Shadow's reply. Then Selber was dashing for the corner with Mance behind him. All the while, the rugged Hydra head was shooting back, hoping to nail the Shadow in the doorway. From that shelter, the Shadow fired as Mance turned the corner. Again, flames rallied to a criminal's aid. These were the flames that roared through the study walls, flaring up from the supporting beams. Literally, that fiery mass swallowed the floor of the entire room, and the Shadow plunged as the whole room caved into a flaming pit. Clutching the doorway as he went, the Shadow clung there, watching the collapse. Glencoe's body, the desk behind it, finally the big safe, went splashing into a sea of red fire that spouted like a mighty geyser, seeking another victim in the person of the Shadow. One heave and the Shadow was clear of the lashing flame, safe in the hallway that formed a last oasis amid disaster. The Shadow reached the corner of the passage, only to find it transformed into another pit of flame that Mance and Selber had just managed to bridge. The route to the conservatory was cut off. It was from that direction that new waves of fire had reached the doomed study. One path alone remained, the back staircase to the second floor. It led up and down, nevertheless. The Shadow took the stairs ahead of a rising wall of fire. On the floor above, he saw the outline of a window. Through a raging torrent of smoke clouded red, floorboards cracked and fell as the Shadow dove across them, but his lunging arms reached the window and dove through the space from which glass had already cracked and fallen. Again, the Shadow's hauling hands made up for lack of footing. Over the sill, he struck headlong on a small sloping roof of slate that held the temperature of a griddle. That ordeal was short, for the roof gave as the Shadow struck it, and he scaled off to the ground, landing clear of burning porch posts and a shower of loosened slates that seemed to hiss their heat as they knifed into the turf and stopped there, upright like Druid monuments in miniature. Cars were spurting away through a back driveway off to the left of the house. Seeing an abandoned sedan, the Shadow reached it, found the keys that the frightened owner had left, and started the blistered car away from the tremendous mountain of flame and smoke that now entirely obscured the whole of Glencoe's home. The chase, however, was short-lived. It ended at the emergency entrance of a hospital 2 miles from Glencoe's. The vehicles ahead weren't trucks. nor even the sort of getaway cars that crooks might use. They were limousines, piloted by faithful chauffeurs, who had brought the burned and injured guests from Glencoe's fiery party. Mance and his Hydra followers had gone the other direction. With many roads to choose, their 4 mile start would be sufficient. Dealing with them would be a matter of the future. Such was the Shadow's verdict as he turned the borrowed car around and started back toward the mighty beacon that had once been Glencoe's home. Great flames lashing to the sky, billows of smoke that rose to heights of clouds, were symbols of the wrath that the Hydra, vast organization of evil heads, would wreak upon whatever men of wealth it chose to devour as its victims. Never in the history of modern crime had there existed so terrible a menace as the Hydra. But there was something that all Hydra heads, Mance included, could remember, along with those workers who termed themselves eyes, ears, and teeth. With all their individual effort, plus the fury of the Holocaust they had created, these men who formed the Hydra had failed to obliterate a lone foe who tonight had challenged them with single-handed might. He could still rise to challenge them, should the Hydra foment new crime. He was crime's nemesis, the Shadow.